The year was 1888, and the wind across the Wyoming Territory had a will of its own, a ceaseless sculptor of the land and the people who dared to settle upon it. It peeled topsoil from hopeful fields, stole warmth from inside log walls, and carried the sound of loneliness for miles. On a high, exposed plateau where the sky felt too large and the earth too spare, Elara Vance began to dig. She did not dig a well, for their creek still ran clear. Nor did she dig the foundation for a new cabin, as the one she shared with her two small children was sturdy enough. She dug a trench, a great, perplexing scar in the prairie grass, oriented east to west. Every day, from just after sunrise until the light began to fail, she worked with a rhythm that was part grief, part defiance. Her movements were economical, born of a body that knew its limits and a mind that had calculated the immense energy required for the task ahead. With a spade her late husband Thomas had prized for its balance, and a wheelbarrow whose squeal was the only protest against the silence, she was excavating a space that made no sense to anyone who saw it. It was Silas Croft, a man whose opinions were as hard and unyielding as the winter ground, who was the first to stop his wagon. He was a practical man, a man who believed in the proven ways of sod-busting and the wisdom of shared hardship. And what he saw troubled the very foundations of his pragmatism. He watched Elara for a long time, her slight frame silhouetted against a mountain of excavated earth, before he finally called out, his voice rough against the wind. "What in God's name are you digging, Elara? A grave for a giant?" His attempt at humor was thin, a brittle covering for his genuine concern, which to him felt indistinguishable from judgment. He saw a widow, alone and vulnerable, wasting her precious summer strength on a project that was, in his estimation, pure madness. He saw the coming winter in his mind's eye, a predator that culled the weak and the foolish, and he saw Elara Vance digging her family's way directly into its path. Elara paused, resting one hand on the worn handle of the spade, and looked up at him. She did not shield her eyes from the sun. She met its glare and his with the same steady calm. "I am building a garden, Silas," she said, her voice even and clear, carrying easily on the wind that sought to tear it away. The simplicity of her answer only deepened his confusion. A garden was a flat piece of tilled earth, exposed to the sun and the rain. It was not a pit. He dismounted from his wagon, his boots sinking slightly into the pile of dark, rich soil she had carefully separated from the paler, clay-like earth beneath. He gestured at the hole, which was now nearly 20 feet wide, 40 feet long, and already 4 feet deep. "This is no garden. This is a hole. The ground freezes 6 feet deep here, woman. You're digging your own cold cellar to live in, and you'll kill your crop before it even sprouts." He was not being cruel. He was stating a fact as he understood it, offering the harsh charity of his certainty. His wife, Eleanor, offered a different kind of charity. From the relative safety of community opinion, she translated Elara's labor into a more digestible narrative of tragedy. "It's the grief," she would say to the other women at the small trading post, her voice hushed with a pity that was sharp around the edges. "Poor thing. Thomas's passing has unseated her mind. Digging all day like a badger, with those two little ones running wild. It's a shame. Someone ought to intervene." This sentiment rippled through the small, scattered settlement, creating a consensus of sorrowful disapproval. Elara became a cautionary tale, a subject of worried gossip and head-shaking sympathy. They saw her not as a woman with a plan, but as a woman who had lost one. Amusement, for many, was a safer position than outright condemnation, and the tale of the widow's great hole became a source of grim humor, a story to be told with a sigh and a knowing look that confirmed their own sanity and adherence to the established, brutal order of things. Only one person watched without judgment. Martha Gable, a woman whose hands were as calloused as any man's and whose silence was often mistaken for aloofness, would sometimes pause her work to watch Elara from the edge of her own property, a half-mile distant. She saw not madness, but a purpose so profound it required no explanation. She saw the careful separation of soils, the deliberate angling of the trench's walls, the relentless, methodical progress. Martha had seen a coyote dig its den on the leeward side of a hill and had watched grouse shelter from a blizzard in the deep powder collected in a ravine. She did not understand what Elara was building, but she recognized the instinct behind it. It was the wisdom of the creature that knows its environment intimately, the kind of knowledge that could not be debated or dismissed, only observed. And so she watched, her curiosity a quiet counterpoint to the chorus of ridicule and pity. Elara was aware of the talk, of the stares and the whispers. She felt them like a change in barometric pressure, a weight in the air. But they could not touch the core of her conviction, for her project was not born of madness or grief, but of memory and observation. It was Thomas's voice she heard, not the gossip's. Thomas, a geologist before the promise of land had lured him west, had taught her to read the story of the earth. He had carried a love for its deep, slow logic, a logic that superseded the frantic scrabbling of men on its surface. He had never been a farmer, but he understood the principles that governed all life, the transfer of energy, the properties of insulation, the profound influence of topography. He saw the world not as a static backdrop, but as a dynamic system of forces, a constant negotiation between rock, wind, water, and sun. She remembered one specific afternoon in their first spring on the plateau. They had been walking the boundaries of their claim when Thomas stopped and pointed to a shallow, south-facing depression, no bigger than their cabin's main room. Inside it, a patch of purple pasque flowers was in full bloom, their delicate heads vibrant against the still dormant landscape. Everywhere else, the prairie was a uniform brown, but in this small hollow, life had arrived a full week early. "See that, Elara?" he had said, his voice filled with a teacher's quiet excitement. "It's a sun trap. The low angle of the spring sun hits that south-facing slope directly. The dip protects the ground from the wind, so the warmth isn't stolen away. And the earth itself? It's a reservoir. It soaks up that heat all day and bleeds it back out all night." He had crumbled the soil in his hands. This little pocket lives by different rules. It has its own season. That memory was the seed of her great hole. The principle was simple, but its application was audacious. If a small, natural depression could create its own microclimate, then a large, man-made one could do so on a scale that would sustain her family. She was not merely digging a hole. She was sculpting the land to create a sanctuary. The high northern wall, which would eventually rise even higher with the excavated earth piled upon its edge, would be a bulwark against the prevailing winter winds, the primary thief of warmth and life. The entire structure, sunken deep into the ground, would benefit from the planet's immense thermal mass, the stable, deep earth temperature that remained just below the frost line. The floor of her garden would be insulated from the deadly surface cold by the very ground that her neighbors feared. It would be a place that lived by its own rules, a place with its own season. She had tried to explain this to Silas on that first day. She spoke of the wind and the sun's angle, of the earth as a blanket. "The wind steals the heat, Silas," she had repeated, hoping the simple words might find purchase. "And the ground holds it. If I can get my plants below the level of the wind, into the calm air, and closer to the earth's deep warmth, I can extend the season. On both ends. We could have greens into November, maybe later." He had looked at her as if she were speaking a foreign language, his face a mask of stubborn disbelief. Watching an outcome, she realized, was not the same as understanding the principle. He had seen the early flowers in the hollows his whole life, but had registered it only as a curiosity, a quirk of nature. He had never asked why. His knowledge was a collection of traditions and outcomes, a list of what to do, passed down without the underlying theory. Her knowledge, gifted to her by Thomas, was a grasp of the theory itself, from which she could derive a new way of doing. The conversation was hopeless. He saw a woman digging. She saw herself arranging the fundamental forces of the natural world. The work consumed her summer. It was a singular, monumental act of will and labor. Her hands, once soft, became hardened and calloused, the skin cracking despite the tallow she rubbed into them each night. The muscles in her back and shoulders burned with a constant, deep ache that eventually settled into a feeling of solid strength. She rose before the sun, drank her coffee while studying the lightening sky, and then went to the trench. Her children, 7-year-old Caleb and 5-year-old Anna, played nearby, their small hands helping to clear rocks from the excavated soil or carrying her water. They did not understand the grand design, but they understood their mother's purpose. Her labor was the steady rhythm of their lives, the squeak of the wheelbarrow, a familiar song. They were not running wild, as Eleanor Croft claimed. They were tethered to a project that was for them, and they felt its gravity. Every part of the process was deliberate. She did not simply move earth, she curated it. The first foot of dark, rich topsoil, teeming with life, was carefully scraped away and piled separately. This was the precious blanket she would later return to the garden floor. The next several feet of paler subsoil and clay were hauled to the north and west sides of the excavation, building up the berm that would serve as her primary windbreak. When she hit shale, she used a pickaxe, the jarring shocks traveling up her arms to break it apart. The larger, flat stones she salvaged from this layer and from the nearby creek bed were set aside. She used them to build a low retaining wall along the base of the sloped sides to prevent erosion, and to construct a set of shallow, sturdy steps at the eastern end, providing the only gentle access to her sunken world. She thought constantly of water, imagining a summer cloudburst or the great melt of spring. At the lowest point of the garden floor, in the southwestern corner, she dug a deep sump, nearly 10 feet down, and filled it with rocks to act as a dry well, ensuring her creation would not become a muddy pond. By the time the aspens in the distant foothills began to turn yellow, the shape of her vision was complete. It was an 80-foot-long, 30-foot-wide rectangle, sunk 10 feet into the prairie. The earthen berm on the north side rose another 6 feet above the surrounding plain, creating a 16-foot wall of solid earth against the wind. The southern side was left open, a wide invitation to the low-hanging winter sun. She spent 2 weeks hauling the reserved topsoil back down the stone steps, bucket by bucket, and spreading it across the garden floor, mixing it with compost from her small manure pile. When she was finished, she stood at the western edge and looked down into the space she had made. The air within it was already different. It was still. The ceaseless wind that combed through the prairie grass above her head was absent down there, the silence in its place profound. She had carved a pocket of calm out of the heart of the storm. The first hard frost arrived in late September, a glittering white blanket that appeared overnight. It crisped the leaves on her neighbor's squash vines and blackened their potato plants. A hurried, frantic harvest began across the plateau, a race against the killing cold. In Elara's sunken garden, however, the frost was a different creature. It settled lightly on the upper leaves of her kale and collards, but seemed unable to penetrate deep into the foliage. By mid-morning, when the sun cleared the eastern edge of the garden, it had melted away, leaving the plants unharmed, their deep green color vibrant against the dark soil. She had planted late, trusting her design, and her crops were now reaching a maturity her neighbors could only dream of. This was the first test, the first piece of tangible evidence that the principle was sound. She felt a deep, quiet satisfaction, a feeling as solid and foundational as the earth she had moved. As autumn deepened, the difference grew more pronounced. The prairie turned a uniform, brittle brown. The wind sharpened, carrying the first hints of snow. Her neighbors' gardens were bare, tilled under, the harvest, such as it was, stored away in root cellars. But Elara's garden was an oasis of impossible green. She continued to harvest lettuce, spinach, and radishes. She had even constructed several small cold frames over her hardiest greens, using old window sashes Thomas had salvaged years before. At night, she would cover these with heavy burlap sacks, trapping the small amount of warmth the soil had absorbed during the day. This was not a passive system. It required tending. It demanded her attention and her understanding. She was not just a laborer anymore. She was a custodian of a climate she herself had created. She had to trust the process, trust that the deep earth beneath her feet would hold its warmth against the coming onslaught, a slow, steady exhalation of stored summer sun. The first great blizzard of the winter arrived in mid-January. For 3 days, the world disappeared behind a churning wall of white. The wind howled with a predatory fury, a physical presence that shook the walls of the sturdiest cabins and drove snow through the tiniest cracks. The temperature plummeted to 30 below zero, a cold so absolute it felt like it could freeze the very air in one's lungs. Across the plateau, families huddled around their stoves, burning through precious wood and coal, the walls of their homes radiating a biting chill. The world was reduced to the small, shrinking circle of warmth cast by a fire. They were under siege, their survival a matter of endurance. For Elara and her children, the experience was different. The massive berm of earth she had built now protected the northern wall of her own cabin, and the snow piled up against it in a deep, insulating drift that muffled the wind's scream to a distant moan. Their small home was quieter, warmer, and safer than it had ever been. When the storm finally broke on the fourth morning, the silence was as stunning as the noise had been. Elara dressed in her warmest layers and stepped outside into a transformed world. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the sun glittered on a landscape buried under 4 feet of fresh snow, with drifts piled 3 times as high. It was a world of stark, beautiful, and lethal simplicity. Armed with her shovel, she began to clear a path, not to her woodpile or her well, but toward the eastern end of her hidden garden. The entrance was completely buried under a massive drift. It took her over an hour of strenuous digging to carve a narrow channel down to the top of the stone steps. As she descended, the change was immediate and astonishing. With each step down, the biting wind at her back vanished. The air grew still. The temperature, while still well below freezing, was palpably, undeniably warmer than the air on the surface. It was as if she had stepped into another day, another season. She made her way to one of the cold frames, its glass covered with a thick, powdery layer of snow. She swept it away with her gloved hand. Inside, beneath the glass, was a sight that made her breath catch in her throat. The kale and hardy lettuces were not just alive, they were thriving. They were a deep, vibrant green, untouched by the devastating cold that had frozen the world just a few feet above their heads. There was no frost on them, no sign of wilting or damage. Slowly, reverently, she lifted the heavy glass sash. The air that rose to meet her smelled of damp earth and living plants. She reached in and broke off a leaf of kale. It was crisp and cold, but it yielded with the snap of life, not the brittle fracture of something frozen solid. She put the piece in her mouth and chewed. The taste was clean and green, slightly bitter, the unmistakable flavor of fresh food, of sustenance, of life itself in the very heart of a frozen, dormant world. It was the taste of vindication. A slow, warm smile spread across her face, a private triumph in the quiet, insulated air of her creation. It was done. It worked. The principle had held true against the worst the Wyoming winter could throw at it. Thomas had been right. It was not magic. It was physics. It was the simple, elegant logic of the natural world, a logic available to anyone who took the time to observe, to question, to understand. Her neighbors, huddled in their cabins, fought the winter as an enemy, a besieging force to be endured. She had simply stepped out of its way. She had used the earth to shield her from the wind and the sun to warm her small patch of ground. She had not conquered the winter. She had negotiated a truce with it on a small piece of land that now answered to her rules. The quiet satisfaction she felt was profound, a warmth that spread through her chest, more potent than any wood stove. The blizzard had been a crucible for everyone. By the end of the month, its true cost was becoming clear. Many of Silas Croft's stored vegetables, kept in a shallow root cellar that was too close to the surface, had frozen solid and then turned to a foul-smelling mush as they thawed. His family was facing the hungry months of late winter with dwindling supplies of flour and salted meat. Necessity finally forced him to do what his pride had forbidden. One cold, bright afternoon, he walked the half-mile to Elara's cabin, his feet crunching on the packed snow, his hat held in his hand despite the cold. He expected to be met with pity, or perhaps a kind of smug, unspoken, "I told you so." He expected to have to beg. He came to ask for a handful of potatoes, if she had any left, to see his family through. Elara met him at the door. She saw the worry etched around his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. She simply nodded and said, "Come with me, Silas." She did not lead him to her cabin's larder. Instead, she led him to the path she had cleared, down the stone steps and into the silent, waiting air of her sunken garden. Silas stopped at the bottom of the steps, his mouth falling slightly open. He stared at the rows of green plants, some covered by glass, others standing open to the cold air, their leaves a defiant declaration of life. He looked from the kale to the snow-covered berms rising high above him, to the impossible stillness of the air. He seemed to be recalibrating his entire understanding of the world. Elara went to a small, insulated door set into the western wall of the garden, a tiny root cellar she had dug into the earth itself, and brought out a basket containing carrots and potatoes, all firm and fresh. She handed it to him, then walked to a cold frame, lifted the glass, and cut a large head of crisp lettuce. Silas took the vegetables, his gaze still fixed on the impossible green. He reached out a hand and touched a kale leaf, as if to confirm it was real. He looked at Elara, and the hard certainty in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, humbling bewilderment. He took one of the carrots from the basket, rubbed the fine layer of dirt from it on his sleeve, and took a bite. The loud, sharp crunch echoed in the profound quiet of the garden. He chewed slowly, his eyes closed for a moment. Finally, he looked directly at her. "I'll be," he whispered, the words small in the vastness of her success. He shook his head slowly, a gesture of complete surrender. After a long, silent moment, he met her eyes again, and the admission came, plain and unadorned. "You were right, Elara. We all thought you were mad. We were the fools." That single, plainly spoken admission changed everything. It was a crack in the dam of community skepticism, and soon the knowledge began to flow. The next spring, Silas Croft, along with 2 other men from neighboring claims, came to Elara not with advice or pity, but with a request for instruction. They stood before her, their hats in their hands once more, and asked her to teach them. She took them down into her garden, which was already green with the first plantings of the new season, weeks ahead of the thawing prairie above. She did not hoard her knowledge or gloat in her victory. She shared it freely, explaining the principles Thomas had taught her. She showed them how to orient the excavation to the sun, how to calculate the depth needed to escape the wind, the critical importance of the northern berm, and the logic of proper drainage. She gave them the theory, the why behind the what, empowering them to adapt the design to their own land. Over the next decade, the landscape of the plateau began to change. The sight of a family digging a great hole in the ground was no longer a sign of madness, but a symbol of hope and foresight. The sunken gardens, which came to be known as Vance Hollows, became a defining feature of the settlement. They were not all identical. Each was adapted to the specific contours of the land it was cut into, a testament to the fact that the settlers now understood the principles, not just the process. The hungry months of late winter became a thing of the past. Families not only survived, but thrived, with fresh vegetables to supplement their diets year-round. The innovation, born of one woman's memory, intellect, and sheer determination, had fundamentally altered the community's relationship with the harsh land they called home. Elara Vance's great hole had not been a grave. It had been a cradle, a hidden valley of her own making that nurtured her family and, eventually, all the people who had once laughed at her. Her legacy was written not in stone, but in the deep, living earth itself, a quiet, permanent testament to the woman who had listened to the land instead of just fighting it, and who had outlasted every single one of her doubts.